All right. Good morning. Welcome to Gardening on the Gulf Coast. We're ready to get started. As always, we appreciate you tuning in to our programs. We have a terrific speaker this morning, but just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you will mute your microphones and turn off your video, it generally makes the presentation run so much more smoothly. At the conclusion of the program today, you'll be receiving a link to a survey. We appreciate if you fill those out and return them to us because they really help us to shape and form the programs. And then you'll also receive a link to the recording of the program. We have a good slate of programs coming up for the remainder of the year as well. So make sure that you check the website for that and get signed up for those. Next presentation is me. I'll be doing a presentation on the differences between Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving cactus. And then on December 1st, we have Landscape Design Basics by Michael Potter. So make sure that you get in and sign up for those, and please make sure that you share those with your friends and other gardening enthusiasts. Our speaker this morning is Stephen Brueggerhoff. Stephen Brueggerhoff is actually taking a new position in Galveston, so I know that he's excited about that, and he's going to do a terrific presentation for you this morning on pecans and about growing pecans as part of your home garden. So please welcome Stephen Brueggerhoff. Oh, by the way, if you have questions this morning, just type them into the chat and we'll get them answered as quickly as possible. And once again, thank you for joining us. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for the gracious introduction. And thank you all for joining us this morning. I don't know about y'all, but it's raining buckets down here in Lamarck, Texas. So I'm the county horticulturist for Galveston County, just on the job for about the last 3 weeks and really loving it. The office itself, oftentimes people think it's in Galveston on the island. It's actually in Lamarck, Texas, which is a little suburban community right outside of the island. So if you have a chance, come on down to the island, explore a little bit. We've got a demonstration garden here at our office as well, run by our master gardeners. We just try to make the best of it. But we are here to provide you with best research-based information that will help you improve the skills that you already have. I'll be talking, as Kevin mentioned, I'll be talking about pecans at home today. Now, I've heard some folks say that pecan trees at home, you're either into production or you treat them as a shade tree, and I think that you can get the benefit of both if you if you apply the right kind of techniques to maintaining that tree as you nurture it and grow with it at your home. So these programs are brought to you by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. We offer research-based education information that helps consumers, understand how our food choices impact our health. And we do that through larger initiatives, through branded programs like the Earthkind Landscaping Program. You can find out information about that program from from Aggie Horticulture. Just go into your browser, type in Aggie Horticulture, and you'll wind up there. The benefit of having information coming from our resources is we're Texas-centric. We know our plants. Now, there are other institutions that we do recognize and that we do appreciate the value of the resources being committed in other states. But of course, if you want information that's Texas-based, come to Aggie Horticulture. There's another initiative that we have called Path to the Plate. Path to the Plate is a suite of programs that are designed to help us understand how food gets from the farm to our plate. We have more programs in line. As Kevin had mentioned, browse online to your extension office to see what events and programs that we have upcoming for you. Kevin is down in Nueces County. If you have a chance, go on down to Nueces County. It's a wonderful drive and a great opportunity to get around and explore coastal gardening. So a little bit about pecans. This is just an overview of the program we'll be enjoying today. Just for your information, the slide set is about 25 slides long. But I anticipate with a little bit of discussion, we'll be able to get you in and out in about 45 minutes. So thank you again for joining us this morning. We'll talk a little bit about pecan biology. Where do pecans come from? We'll talk a little bit about your location. How can you grow these plants successfully? And it's all dependent on your region and the environment that you've created, your local ecology. So that's very important to understand that. Of course, but only certain pecan varieties will do well depending on where you're located along the Gulf Coast. We'll talk a little bit about pecan planting, maintenance, pests, and harvest, and then I'll provide some resources. And as Kevin had mentioned, this program is being recorded and we will be available as an archive. So if you're writing furiously, don't let me stop you. I love to take notes myself, but rest assured that you can always go back and revisit some of these resources later on. So a little bit about pecans. Pecans are native to North America and Mexico. Of course, we know that pecans are the state tree of Texas. You should know what the state flower of Texas is, the bluebonnet. But these are two plants that are not really related other than a cultural identity. Pecans are actually a member of the same family that other nut-bearing trees belong to. So pecans have a really wide distribution throughout the United States. They can be found up into the Midwest, naturally distributed up into the Midwest. Oftentimes, if you look at larger distribution maps, original distribution maps, you'll see the pecans follow the course of larger bodies of water like the Mississippi River, other rivers, etc. We know that they are large deciduous trees, and that's important to keep in mind, especially if you're deciding to plant a pecan tree in your front yard and if you have a house in the city itself, maybe you have an existing pecan tree, it's already a large tree. But if you're thinking about planting a pecan, we need to keep in mind their size because that will make a difference in the production and the health of the tree itself. Did you know that the word pecan is determined to come from the Algonquin word pecane, loosely translated as nuts requiring a stone to crack? Now, the native pecans are very much smaller varieties. If you've gone into natural areas, let's say you're onto someone's property and they have a collection of pecans out in their pasture that have grown up by themselves. We call those natives, or those are natives, and oftentimes they're referred to as seedling plants as well, seedling trees. They're oftentimes smaller than the improved varieties that have been developed over time. But if you've ever been to a pecan show or have seen a pecan board, I've got a pecan board in my office. That's it right behind me. It's blown up so that you can see it a little bit better. There are hundreds of varieties of pecans that have been developed over time. But again, we're just going to focus on the ones that we can be most successful with in our region. Pecans produce leaves that are what we call pinnately compound leaves. So what that means is instead of one single leaf on a stem, you have a leaf that's comprised of multiple leaflets. So if you've ever looked closely at a pecan, like the one I have in this illustration, in this image on this slide, you'll notice that they are one long stem with a lot of little leaflets on that. So they're comprised of compound leaves. They have about 9 to 7 leaflets on that. That helps in identification of these particular plants. Again, we know that they can get really, really large, but did you know the pecans are wind pollinated? So that's an important concept to think about as far as the plants themselves. Oftentimes when we think of plants and pollination biology, we think of the top 3 megafauna, the butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds. There, of course, there are more pollinators than that. But for this particular plant species, these are wind pollinated. So keep that in mind as we keep going through this presentation. We know that pecans can be found across a wide distribution, natural wide distribution in the United States and North America, parts of Mexico as well. Typically, we apply a we refer to the USDA hardiness zone map. So we know that they can grow across the board from zone 5 to zone 9. Here in Galveston County, we're rated around zone 9. Brazoria County, 9A and 9B. 9B means it's just a little bit warmer as you get along right up on the edge of the coast. So keeping all of this in mind, where these plants are naturally distributed, how cold they can, how much they can sustain during cold events, what varieties are appropriate for our area, and that's really all dependent on where we are located on this good green earth. So, going back to the plant itself, let's dig a little bit deeper into the flowering structures of this plant, of this majestic plant. Remember, they're wind pollinated. The inflorescence on a pecan tree, or the flowers, are comprised of a terminal bud. Oftentimes that bud can contain a mix of female or pistillate inflorescence. We call that the nutlet. It can also have lateral floral buds. Those are three-stalked catkin, right, or males. So let me show you really quick. Let's see if this animation works. It does. Hooray! So I know this image is not a close-up of it. You kind of have to imagine where this is located. I also encourage you to go online and explore flower plant, flowering portions of the plant itself. Go online, type in pecan inflorescence or pecan flowers, and you'll be provided with a wealth of information of what that looks like up close. Now again, for this presentation, because I do have limited time, and because there is so much to explore with pecans, I'll be able to graze over this information, present it, in caps for you. So we do have other programs, of course. If you go to your extension office, keep in mind that we offer programs on fruit and nut production locally. So just keep aware of that, and it's all seasonal as well. We're going to start doing that next year here in Galveston County in 2022. But anyway, getting back to this point, the inflorescence is presented on a terminal bud, and as the bud expands, you will have a point of that. Usually it's at the very tip. That's the nutlet. That's the female reproductive organ. It's a pistillate organ, right? The pistil is the female reproductive organ, technically. And then after that, you'll have an expression of male catkins. And those are those like long tassels that you'll see towards the back end of the new growth. Now, because these are wind pollinated plants, to improve production, we do recommend that you get what we call a pollinizer for consistent pecan production. This is very important in commercial production. We know that these guys are, they're wind pollinated. I view pollinators like bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. In a way, I look at them as accidental pollinators. They're going for a resource. And maybe they, in the case of a bee or native bees, they'll collect pollen and put them in little pollen sacks and carry them to their nest for food. But there's parts of that pollen that gets caught on their bodies. And that part is, that's more of an accidental thing. It's not a purposeful action that they're taking. They're not taking the pollen purposely from one flower to another. Rather, they're gathering it for themselves and then delivering it by having it, transferred from their body onto another part of the plant, of another plant. In this case, because these pecans are wind pollinated, it's kind of left to chance. Literally, the pollen is blowing with the wind. So it's important to understand, for good production, it is a good idea to think about getting a pollinizer. Now, there's a caveat. I do have a caveat for you, for the homeowner that are cultivating pecans at home. There may be native pecans that are located in a pasture near you. It's all about proximity. Remember, we're dependent on the wind for this pollinating event. So there may be a native that's around. Maybe a neighbor has another pecan tree. More than likely, if you've got limited space, you may only be able to afford to plant out one pecan tree. But if you do have the space, I do recommend to plant at least 2. And there are those that are appropriate that we look at as pollinizers. I'm showing you a chart here that's related to their flowering structures. In pecans are either determined to be protandrous, meaning that as those reproductive organs, as the tissue expands and the reproductive organs are expressed. The male and the female flowers are expressed. Those that are protandrous shed pollen prior to receptivity on the female reproductive organ. So I'll repeat that. Protandrous, those varieties that are determined to be protandrous, express their pollen or shed their pollen prior to the female reproductive organ being receptive to that. So self-pollination is often not going to happen, right? Because you've got pollen that's shedding and the female's just not ready for it on one plant. Therefore, you need another plant that is determined to be protogynous. Protogynous meaning the stigma or the female reproductive organ is receptive prior to the pollen shedding. And this chart I borrowed from TexasPecanNursery.com. It illustrates at a quick and easy digestible chart those varieties when they're shedding pollen, when the female reproductive organ is receptive to that pollen, and it's all kind of lined up. So if you're looking at pulling in a variety that is scab resistant, like desirable, you can match it up with another variety like Elliott. Elliott would be a good pollinizer for that particular variety. So once we understand that kind of biology, we'll be a little bit more successful. If you're a home enthusiast that wants to sell pecans at a farmer's market, this kind of information is very valuable to you, because even though you might be a small producer, right, you still want as much production as you can get from those plants so that you will be successful when you're ready to go to market. For the homeowner, I think this is good information anyway. You got to know what these flowering structures are and the basic biology of these plants. Now, it really is about location. Where are you located? I've seen some master gardeners that have come on, or maybe not master gardeners. I've seen some individuals that have come on to this presentation saying they're from Fort Bend. Excellent. I love a great colleague out in Fort Bend, horticulturist Boone Holiday. Shout out to Boone if he's watching. If he's not, that's fine too. We're all really, really busy in our respective offices, but I respect the programs that Boone has. He's got a pecan show actually going. I believe it's going right now, or maybe it's happening very, very soon, and a festival associated with that. It's always exciting to go to the pecan shows or enter into a pecan show if you have some to lend. You have the ability to get an award all the way up to the state level. So I suggest that you celebrate pecans in your area. Even though we're more about citrus here in this county, I'm still very excited about pecan culture and pecan festivals as well. So to grow these plants, just like any plant, you really have to know where your location is and the environment that you're in to understand how to grow these plants successfully. Here's an illustration that I borrowed from out of context from another organization. I believe it's the Houston Galveston Area Council. They had a really nice map of the surrounding counties, so I thought I'd just borrow that really quickly to illustrate the differences in rainfall in our area. So it's good to know how much water you get. You're going to be raising pecans differently if you live in the hill country than if you live here on the Gulf Coast. Here in the surrounding counties, we could get rain anywhere from 49 inches to 58 inches. I believe 58 inches was right around, on average, per year, is right around Chambers County. Okay, so that's quite a bit of rain, and it's all about where they live. Liberty County, I think it's rated at about 57 inches, so they get high rainfall. They have soils that can get highly saturated. They do have more acidic soils up there in Liberty County, and as you start stretching into Montgomery County, as you get right on the edge of that pine curtain that we call the pine curtain here in Texas, down here in Galveston County, Brazoria County, the pH range of our soils is about, on average, is about 6.5. It's roughly in that sweet spot. So we're very, very fortunate inland, to be where we're at. But even then, here's an example for Brazoria County. They've got alluvial loams and clays, right? So it's referred to as Lake Charles clay, which means it's the the soil profile has low permeability. Highly productive if you can get it to work, but just keep in mind we've got a high clay content which can affect these trees. Some of the things that you're going to need for successful pecan production: full sun, don't skimp on the sun. 10 plus hours of sunlight. Get that plant out in direct sun because it's going to need it. But also well draining soils, which is difficult to find depending on where you live in your respective counties. So you see what I'm saying about, it's all about location. You really have to understand what your local environmental conditions are like, as well as your local geography. Geology is like, geography and geology is like to successfully work with these plants. Now, there is a resource that you can find this information online. USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service does offer a web soil survey for those of us who may have visited extension offices in our youth. What I mean by youth is maybe you were in your 20s and now you're older. And you would go to the extension office. There was a little publication. There was a publication that was very robust, and it was a soil survey map in print form. That is all online now. I'm sure we all know this by now, but if you don't, you can go to this particular website, websoilsurvey.sc.egov.usda.gov, and find out specific information about that the soil profile where you live, whether you're in the city or in a rural area. Right? Now we know in the urban environment, in the city, the soil profile has been mixed due to development. You're going to get at least a good idea of the foundation that you're working with when you're developing your orchard or planting your pecan tree in your yard. All right, let's see. Folks, we're doing pretty good on time. It's about 15 minutes after, or about 20 minutes after. Of course, if you have any questions, put them in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that. Again, thank you very much, Kevin, for joining me and assisting, answering any questions. A little bit more about pecans. I'll bet you didn't know that pecans were not commercially grown until the 1880s. I think that's interesting information. You don't know where you're going until you know where you've been, right? So you gotta, it's good to know this information. The pecans, pecan commercial production, it's still kind of a young industry if you think about it. Here's some information about top production in 2014. I need to update this information, so I apologize for the outdated information. But at least it gives you a good idea of how many pecans were produced in North America. U.S. produced 132,000 tons of pecans, and those pecans were shipped globally. It's not, they're produced here. The top 3 producers, which still holds true to this day, is Georgia, New Mexico, Texas falls in 3rd. You might, think, well, Georgia, that makes sense. They've got pecans. They're growing the heck out of pecans over in that particular state. But you may scratch your head when you think about New Mexico. What does New Mexico have? What does the plant require? Requires water. Well, you can get water to it. There's quite a bit of area in New Mexico that has brilliant, great sun exposure, and that's one element you cannot skimp on for these trees. So that's why there's higher production in New Mexico, and Texas comes in 3rd. But it's still a strong industry for us. Native improved pecan trees are grown commercially in Texas at that time at an estimated 70,000 acres. That's quite a bit of acreage to be able to get this product from the farm, from the orchard to your plate. Native pecan varieties are vegetatively propagated to assure trueness to type. So what that means is that we're grafting these onto a rootstock. So when you've got a native pecan, when you have a seedling that's growing wild, maybe a squirrel has delivered it graciously to your landscaping bed, you're working with the plant that you're not going to get production on it for at least a good, 7-10 years or more. You're going to have to wait that out. With named pecan varieties grafted onto a rootstock, at least you know what you're going to get. You'll get quicker results as far as production. Maybe you'll only have to wait 5 to 7 years to start getting production on those plants. So that's the advantage of using improved varieties that are grafted onto a rootstock. So a little bit of pecan varieties for Texas. AgriLife Extension does offer a map of different varieties depending on where you're located here in Texas. One thing to keep in mind, there is a disease that is a fungal pathogen that we're highly susceptible to here along the coast. It doesn't matter if you're here in Galveston County or you're going down towards Nueces County. We're in a very high humid environment, and it's ripe for a fungal pathogen called pecan scab. So there are some varieties that are scab resistant, have been developed for the resistance to scab. Kansas, Lakota, Elliott, desirable are some varieties that may be appropriate for your area and are a little bit more scab resistant than some others. So anyway, you can find this chart on Aggie Horticulture in some of the fact sheets that we offer from Aggie Horticulture in the fruit and nut section of that website. Let's talk a little bit about a few varieties that I've worked with here in in my former occupation in Brazoria County, but I look forward to around here. And I've talked to some of the old-timers, some of the folks that have had some history here, and of course they do agree with me in some of the varieties that I'll be presenting today. But again, keep in mind, there's more than just the 3 that I'm presenting. I'm just focusing on these 3 because I happen to like them. All right, here's one that is scab resistant. It's a pecan called Desirable. Produces a large nut. I borrowed these images from another resource online from a research station. At least I love these images because it gives you an idea of the size of the nut itself. If you haven't made a pecan board like the one I have in the back of my in my background, at least you can get an idea of the size and shape of these improved varieties. Provides a medium soft shell to it, easy to crack, very productive, and a consistent bearer. Now, when we are talking about pecans that do bear, sometimes they will be alternate bearing. You may get a couple of years of good production, and then you'll have a decline or reduction in production. That is normal for these trees. So keep that in mind. If you're looking at your pecan tree and you're thinking, everything else is perfect, you've been watering it, you've been fertilizing it, everything that you can think of, you're doing right, and it hasn't provided you with the number of fruits, the number of nuts that you're used to. It's just a natural phenomenon. So don't fret too much. It also could be due to environmental conditions as well. But getting back to pecan Desirable, very productive and a consistent bearer. Now, these are thought to be self-fertile. They will produce more if they do have a pollinizer associated with them. So, while they will bear on their own, keep in mind what I told you earlier. You may have a native seedling somewhere that's really taken hold and is shedding pollen at just the right time for this one to be recepted by this one, or another improved variety that's planted in someone else's yard. So always keep that in mind. For these nuts, they're going to ripen late October to early November. Remember, these trees can get large, so you got to let them get large. I wouldn't, other than an initial pruning, which I'll tell you about that in a minute. Pruning is more, I guess, aesthetic at home with a little bit of improvement to allow airflow through that tree, but you're not going to want to just prune the heck out of that tree annually. And they are cold hardy to USDA Zone 7, especially if you're going further north than where we're at. Here's another variety called Choctaw. Has a large, long nut, again, a thin shell. It's an improved variety, has great production. You might want to consider a pollinizer for Choctaw, maybe like Elliott. There is a chart providing some information. Thank you very much, Kevin, for providing that information. some of the information on the chat box as well for reference. This one is a late pollen shedding variety. It does well in the West, but it also does well in our eastern climates. So in a high humid environment like this, Choctaw will perform well for you. Makes a great large tree. It'll produce nuts right around this time, right around November. And then the last one, which my cousin Sammy, you move somewhere, and then you start encountering people that come into your door and with welcome arms, and they say, "Hi, I'm your cousin from Lake Jackson." So shout out to Sammy if he's watching this. But Sammy likes Forkert. He's grown this out successfully in Lake Jackson. It's a large kernel, thin shell, good production. Does require a pollinizer, but keep in mind what I told you about the other trees, surrounding trees. It's all about proximity. It does produce a large tree, and it's great for landscaping. So I love the variation in these nuts. Let's go back quickly just to kind of remember what they look like. Pecan desirable, more of a rounded nut, a little bit of speckling on it, a little freckling on it. Choctaw is a little bit more clean, but a larger nut. And then you have this long nut Forkert. Pretty cool. Now let's talk about planting. This is one thing that I'm suggesting you don't ignore, right? So planting ornamental trees is a little different than working with pecan trees. Well, before we go any further, Kevin, are there any questions for me so far?
There is a question that just popped up. Kathy would like to know, should you take into consideration the general wind direction when you're trying to decide where to plant your pollinator tree?
Wow. I think that's a great suggestion. I've never considered that. So Kathy, that's a great question, actually. I think that you should take that into consideration. It may actually enhance the chances of pollen reception. Our environment is just so wiggly. Our natural environment is so wiggly. You could have wind coming from the north and south, etc. But if you're in an area where you have predominant wind, maybe it's on a hillside somewhere. Maybe that is a good consideration of placement for the tree. So thank you for that question, Kathy. I like that. So as far as, and thank you, Kevin.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Stephen,
for planting. Oh, go ahead.
Would you plant more pollinator trees than you have producing trees? Would you plant?
Sorry.
In general, would you plant a couple of pollinators to just improve your chances?
Yes, I think so. Again, it depends on the space that I agree with that question, Kevin. Especially if you can afford the space, it's always best to hedge your bets as far as production to provide more than one tree. But this dovetails right into the next part of this, which is planting. Remember what I said, if you've got the space, it's best to think about that, but you've got to give these trees space. So when orchards are being developed, oftentimes they're densely planted with the idea that the orchard manager is going to go in at some point and start culling these plants, start chopping these plants down, right? Because you may have 25 trees planted in an acre. I'm just making this up, folks, so I'm not saying anything I'm quoting. I'm just kind of tossing out numbers. Okay, let's say you planted out 50 trees in an acre, and you may be spacing them 35 feet apart. Over time, you're going to be culling those. You're going to see which ones are the most productive for you, and as a manager, you're going to go through and just start culling them to where once those trees get to a certain maturity, you've got them adequately spaced, at least 75, maybe 100 feet apart. For our yards, oftentimes when we buy a home, we don't have a large profile. We don't have a large, we don't have a large parcel of land that we're working with. So you should definitely keep this in mind. Spacing for these trees should be 70 feet apart at maturity, right? You might be able to get away with 50 feet, 60 feet, but I'd say shoot for 70. Plant them far enough apart. If you're thinking about landscape design, certainly you can put understory trees. Maybe there's an understory tree 35 feet away from your pecan, so it's not interfering with, resources that you're trying to provide for that pecan. Understand though that you're going to need to give these plants space to give them room to produce as optimally as you can. This image I took, I went to a pecan workshop that was provided by Dr. Nesbitt and Dr. Stein and other colleagues in College Station. This is an annual workshop that they provide for those considering getting into the business. And they do have a research station out there with the pecan orchard. So you can kind of get an idea of how far apart these trees are planted. And they may have to come in and depending on how those trees are performing, it provides them an opportunity to cut some down if they're not performing well. So it's all about spacing and what the space that you've got to do this. There's a little chart up here that at least gives you an idea of the number of trees per acre. If you've got 60-foot spacing with these trees, you can get about 12 on an acre. Or maybe about a number of trees per, well, anyway, the chart's up there. I can't really read it because the slide is so super small from my view. Let's see if I can find the slide from here. So if you've got a plant that is 60 by 60 feet, you've given it an optimal room, you can get about 12 trees per acre, or you can possibly get about 6 per half acre. Right? So just do the math. Start thinking about giving those plants some room, and always remember to put them in full sun. Always keep in mind, we're often looking down when we're talking about planting. I encourage you to look up as well, right? See where larger buildings are in proximity to where you're planting that tree, right? We need it to have as much sun as it can get. And if you have a building that's maybe 5 stories high and it casts a shadow at a certain time of year, disrupting the amount of sunshine you're getting on that tree, that's no bueno. You've got to think about putting that tree in another area so you can give it optimal conditions for growth. Oh yeah, and not to mention electric lines, etc. You don't want it to get a bad haircut at some point because the electric company's coming through and they've got to, utility companies have to come through and cut that tree because you planted it under an electric line. So don't do that. And of course, always think about what's underground as well. So as far as planting, I firmly believe it's best to get them bare root. The challenges with bare root, depending on how they're shipped or how long they've been in transit, if you get them from a reliable company, oftentimes you'll get great product that's shipped pretty quickly. As soon as you get that plant in, if it's bare root, plan on planting that out within the next day. Don't wait. You don't want those roots to dry out. If you get the plant in a little earlier, then you're going to have to figure out how to keep the roots moist but not saturated, because you don't want those roots to rot. You can always heal them in on an embankment during the winter if you get them in too early. But again, try to get them as close to planting time as you can so that you can put them in the ground. So bare root trees, they're planted during dormancy, December through March. Plant the day that you receive them if you can, or the earlier you get them in, the better. In other words, I wouldn't wait till March, but sometimes you can't help that depending on where you're getting your tree from. It's not a bad, it is a good practice to at least soak the roots maybe for an hour or two, depending on how dried out they are prior to planting, to make sure that those roots are moistened, prior to getting them in the ground. You can plant them out from a container grown plants that you've bought. And you've got a much longer span of time. The roots are more established. The challenge with that is oftentimes because this plant produces a true taproot and holds onto a taproot even into maturity, right? When we talk about ornamental trees, we know initially they'll have what we consider to be, a structure or a taproot that comes down, but over time, the taproot there's more of a balance underground, more of a net of roots that extend. There's very few trees that hold on to that initial taproot as they grow older. The pecans do. And so that's the challenge with these trees. Since they do have a taproot on them, if they're container grown, oftentimes you're going to have that taproot or other rooting structures that are circling that pot. So that's the challenge that you have to overcome when you're planting these, when you're putting these trees in the ground. So season for getting these in, bare root or container, putting them in during dormancy or as we're going into dormancy for these trees. As far as digging a hole, visit the soil survey to find out where's a good place, what kind of soil profile you have on average for your area. You can get fairly close to where you're at through a GPS tool on that mapping system. Get in touch with your local extension office to determine what that is as well. Send in a soil sample to the soil forage and water testing lab at College Station. The soil samples sent in give you an idea of nutritive value of your soil. You can get tests done that would determine the texture of your soil. You can do that easily, through what I call the spit test. Getting a little clod of dirt and soil and moistening it, and then just kind of rubbing it between your hands, kind of getting a good idea of what the clay content is like. But it's always good to go to these resources to find out, more accurate information than that. That's a good field test you can do, but it's always a good idea to try to get more accurate information of what your soil profile texture is. So when you send in a soil sample to the Texas A&M lab, you're looking at nutritive information that comes from that. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, I believe. There are a few other elements in there that you'll get a report on. It gives you a great foundation to know how to proceed forward as far as annual fertilization of these trees. So, do a perk test, dig a hole down 3 feet. Yes, dig a hole 3 feet into the ground. Find out, you've got a good site. You think it's on a higher part of your property. You pretty much are thinking that it's got good, draining soil. Now and it's in full sun, dig a hole 3 feet down, about 2 feet wide. Do a soil percolation test. In other words, fill it with water and see how quickly that water drains overnight. Measure it, get a tape measure. You can see that in this image here. Get a tape measure, just see how well that water drains. If you're not getting, a couple of inches every hour, then, within about 3 hours, you'll know whether or not you should move that planting site to another area. You've got to account for that taproot. You don't want those roots to start rotting as they grow and develop. Like I mentioned earlier, if you've got them in a container or even bare root, prune any malformed roots. Simple as that. Just cut them off. It'll be fine. As far as planting, always plant at grade. So if you've got a bare root plant, look for that shadow, the darker spot right around where we'd call the flare of the tree, or where the tissue is a little bit more swollen or expanded. Where it formerly was in the pot, oftentimes it'll be a darker shadow, and then it'll be more blonde as you travel up the trunk of the tree. Always plant at grade. Don't plant them any deeper. You can plant them maybe a little bit high for settling, a half an inch, an inch. They'll settle in. But make sure that you don't plant them too deep, because we don't want these plants to be rotting in the ground. Do not put fertilizer in the hole. I cannot emphasize that enough. Oftentimes that, we think we're doing the plant a favor when we're putting fertilizer in the hole. This is not vegetable gardening, right? We're working with fruit trees, so don't put fertilizer in the hole. We don't want to burn those. We want those roots to develop, and we don't want to have them coming in contact with a product that can literally burn or affect the root development. As you're planting them, dig out native soil, put back in the native soil. If you've got the right spot, no need to worry about, you're not going to be putting any additional media in there. That tree has to exist in the soil profile, because it's so deep, you couldn't put enough material in there to make a difference. So make sure you pick the right spot and put that native soil back in. As you're putting it in, water it, right? Put down a third of that soil back in, water it. let the water absorb a little bit, put the more back soil in there. What we're trying to do is reduce air pockets within that soil environment. We're trying to get good root to soil contact. Then after you're done with it, kind of tamp it down a little bit, then provide some mulch on top of that. As far as fertilizer, my recommendation when you're putting out these trees for the first time, you've got a sapling or a bare root plant that you've just put in the ground, give it some time. If you don't see any growth by April, back up and evaluate that. You should be getting some growth by then, but if you're not, there may be other conditions within the soil profile, something else that's going on. Just evaluate that. But on a normal, under normal conditions, if you've got growth on that plant, you see it starting to come on, apply about a cup of a nitrogen, a higher nitrogen-rich product like 2100. Again, any fertilization we're providing is going to be based on a soil test that we should have taken already. So 2100 is a high nitrogen product. Apply that, distribute it around the tree itself. Make sure it doesn't touch the trunk of the tree. Back it off a little bit. And then, just let it go. Maybe about April, apply it again in June. And again, this is only if you're seeing growth. If you don't see growth by April, don't apply any fertilizer. Hopefully you'll get growth by June. At that time, then apply fertilizer. So it really depends on your circumstance. Second year, about a cup, 1 cup each, April, May, and June. Mid-April or early April, mid-May, and mid-June. Don't fertilize any later than that. We don't want plant development as we go into colder season. And then you start increasing that over time. There is a chart that I provided here as well that I borrowed from Dr. Nesbitt from a publication that he made as well. So it kind of gives you an idea of how much you're going to be applying to this tree on an annual basis. Again, pay attention to the soil testing that you've committed and base your fertilization regime off of that. If you haven't taken a soil test, you can apply a 10-10-10, a balanced fertilizer, but I often opt to rely on the reports that I get back for accuracy. Just like I mentioned earlier, mature bearing trees, you're going to fertilize them a little bit differently. 2100, pay attention to fruit set. Once they get to be bearing size, once they start to produce those nuts, really going to want to pay attention to fertilization. If they're bearing heavy at a mature stage of development, right? If they've got a lot of nuts on that, and you've shaken the tree to get some of those nuts off of it, or you've got high production, you're going to want to boost that fertilizer towards the end of that season as well. Also, this part is a little difficult to talk about for homeowners. These plants do not take zinc up through their roots. So you cannot apply a zinc, a fertilizer containing zinc and expect results from that. Zinc is applied foliarly. And so at a younger stage, maybe up through that 5th to 7th year, you might be able to get a device or some sort of a blower where you can apply zinc to the foliage and get great saturation. This is important when the tree is first starting off. Right? You need to make sure that it's a healthy tree, and you'll have to apply. I do recommend that you apply zinc, on a regular basis as it's developing. Always keep in mind, whatever product you're putting out, follow the instructions for application. If you're applying something, if you're applying something foliarly, right? If you're applying a product foliarly, you may have some drift. It may be a lot, it may be a little bit. Keep in mind when you're applying it, always morning is best on a windless day. Depending on what kind of product you put out, zinc nitrate is probably better for a home environment because if you do get a little bit of drift on some surrounding trees, more than likely it's not going to cause a burn. But if you use zinc sulfate, you might encounter that. So again, always best practices when applying a product, foliar application for a product, because you will encounter drift. It's just natural. Make sure that you're protected, that you have protective gear on when you're doing this. I believe David Oates, one of our colleagues, he did provide a presentation for gardening on the Gulf Coast. So if you go to our archive, he does talk about PPE, protective plant equipment, protective gear when you're applying chemicals. It's a great video, so you should go back and I recommend that you go back and view it. But again, keep yourself protected when you're applying these products, and keep your neighbors in mind as well. For water, drip irrigation or emitters, want to make sure that you get that water as close to the ground as possible. You know, an impact sprayer spraying over an area, if that's all you've got, that's what you've got. But it's more efficient to use an emitter that's, you know, a drip system with an emitter that's close to the tree or within proximity to the tree, so you get great saturation around the tree. Keep in mind that these trees need consistent water at key times in their development. Mid-March for shoot growth, May to July for nut sizing. These nuts are developing. And then August to September for nut filling, right? You've got these nuts look like they're just about the right size. Well, the kernels still need to develop. And so we need to provide consistent watering at these critical times to make sure you're getting a great product. If you have a pecan tree in the lawn, you may have to provide additional irrigation to it. I know that goes a little bit counterintuitive to when we talk about conserving resources and watering schedule, etc. But keep that in mind. If you've got this tree that's planted in the middle of a lawn, you may want to consider that you may have to apply additional water to that. On average, as they're developing, about 1 inch per week in the spring. As they start to really get into production, you may have to apply approximately 2 inches or more per week in midsummer. But again, keep in mind your soil profile. We don't want to oversaturate those conditions and cause rotting. And then you reduce that as you get into the more dormant season. Well, folks, I'm a little bit long in the tooth in my own program. Kevin, thank you so much for directing those questions that we've been receiving in the chat box. I'm going to go a little bit quicker now. We've got a few more slides. Again, thank you all for joining us this morning on this lovely day. It's raining here in Lamar. But I'll talk a little bit about maintenance now. For these larger trees, if you're thinking about this as a moneymaker, keep in mind, you know, if you're having a pecan tree in your yard as a hobbyist, in other words, you love the shade of the pecan tree, you like the benefit of the pecan nuts, but you're not going to be selling them at the market. It may not be as, this discussion may not be as important to you. If you're thinking about selling these pecans in the future, maybe a small orchard, the challenge for us is you need specialized equipment to be able to do that. Here's an example of some devices that I saw at the pecan workshop that I went to. Depending on the size of the tree, you're going to need specialized equipment. When we have smaller trees that are just growing, saplings that we're just trying to get off the ground, you can get a smaller blower device that is, you know, mechanized with a pump on it and fully cover that canopy. But, you know, as the trees get larger, we don't have that luxury. If you've got a 100-foot tree with a canopy that's at least a good 70 feet wide, you're never going to cover that, you know. So keep that in mind. You know, why you're getting this pecan tree, it helps to be more realistic, I think, about welcoming these trees into our landscape. So again, at some point, are you considering it more as a shade tree, as a cultural benefit, as a bragging right to your neighbors, or a tree that you can enjoy with your children? Or, you know, are you thinking about getting into commercial production? You need to keep that in mind. This is a realistic part of this. For some challenges that we're facing in the environment, we may need to rely, depending on our intent for production, you you may be relying on restricted use pesticides, so not over-the-counter pesticides to work with some of these insects that we might get into our local environment. All right. As a homeowner, we can apply avoidance strategies, get resistant pecan varieties that are resistant to scab. Remember, we're in a more disease-prone area for scab here along the Gulf Coast because we're in a high humid environment. So just choose those varieties wisely. And sanitation. Sanitation goes a long way. When I will have clients that will call up and say, hey, I've got an issue in my landscape. What can I spray to take care of it? Well, I have to back up that discussion a little bit and talk to that client and say, you know, maybe let's talk about cultural activities that you're providing to that tree. Are you pruning this particular tree on an annual basis, allowing airflow through it? Are you providing a clean orchard floor? Are you collecting those leaves as they fall off and disposing of them? So sanitation goes a long way for these trees in our environment. And that's something that we can do. That's very simple that we can do. For these trees, if you've got it in the middle of a yard, well, you've got St. Augustine growing up underneath that tree up to a certain point. You can only mulch out so far, depending on, any kind of visual restrictions you might have from your municipality or your local homeowners association. That's understandable, but we're trying to keep weeds controlled under this. We're trying to get those resources to the tree we're focusing on rather than feeding the weeds, right? So if you've got a little orchard developed, just keep that orchard floor clean. You can do that by hand pulling or herbicides. Use herbicides. Ain't nothing wrong with using herbicides to take care of that problem. With another caveat, if you've got a newly established tree that you're trying to get newly established, for that first year, you may have to rely on hand weeding instead of broadcasting herbicides. You've got to be very careful around that environment for that. This other picture that I have on the lower right-hand side of this slide, that's a large fan blower. This is a monster machine. I can't remember how many hundreds of gallons of liquid it can contain in that thing, but literally that fan shape, it rotates back and forth and projects this wonderful mist of product into your canopy. You can get great saturation with that, but I tell you folks, you can't rent that to apply to your home. That's just not a good idea. Let's look at some insects that you may see. Again, go to Aggie Horticulture to explore more about pecan culture. We've got great resources. I do recommend that you go there. This is one that we often don't see. This is one insect we often don't see along the Gulf Coast, but of course we're monitoring for their occurrence. It's one called the pecan weevil. This is a tiny little insect, about 3/8 of an inch long. Their life cycle is the adults lay eggs in the pecans. As they're developing, the larvae feed on the developing kernels. The larvae is literally what we call the worm. Technically, it's a larvae, so it's okay if you use the word worm, but I'm going to use the word larvae back at you. They chew. They'll feed on the kernel as it develops. They chew a round exit hole. So if you see a lovely pecan that's fallen on the ground and it's got a little hole in it, that means the critter's chewed its way out, and that pecan's probably not any good. Pecan falls to the ground, and the insect chews a hole through, falls to the ground. They can exist in the soil for 2 to 3 years. They can remain in the soil in kind of a dormant state till they're ready to rock on and then form that whole life cycle again. So what we're doing is monitoring for these insects. Again, we're not in a high pressure area for pecan weevils, but it's always good to monitor for these insects at a certain time of year. There are different methods of controlling them if you do have an infestation. One method is putting out what we call a circle trap, which is kind of a trap that's wrapped around the trunk of the tree at a certain height. And then you monitor these until shuck split. For control of these, oftentimes you're going to have to get a licensed applicator for them because of the kind of restricted use pesticides that would take care of the problem pretty quickly. There are, well, anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Just keep that in mind. You may need to hire a licensed applicator to eliminate these insects. Here's one that we will see and we are monitoring for. It's the pecan nut case bearer. About the end of May, it affects small pecans during development. Now you can visit a website. It used to be called IPM Pipe. That was monitored and maintained by a former colleague, Dr. Bill Ree. Was maintaining that for a while, but now it's another organization that's taken it over. It's called it's monitored and supported by AgPest, and the website is agpestmonitor.org. It's a pecan nut case bearer forecast tool. So if you were into production of this for pecans, this is a great resource to go to kind of keep an eye and also report if you happen to see them. If you monitor and you trap them and you find them, you can also report to this map and help our colleagues or our fellows that are raising pecans in their area. These are gray moths, about 1/3 of an inch, not very big. They lay their eggs on developing nuts. As they develop, they hatch and the larvae burrow into the nut. Keep in mind the control for these particular insects, once you do get them, may require a restricted use pesticide. You can use other products containing over-the-counter products containing spinosad, carbaryl, or malathion, or even BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, that is labeled for pecans. So make sure that the product that you're getting, if it is a non-restricted use pesticide, that it is labeled for use on pecans. As far as harvest and storage, when we're talking about shuck split, see that picture? That's what we're talking about. Sometimes, myself, I'm guilty of this as well. We'll start using terminology that the layperson may not, understand what that is. What is shuck split? What is that? Well, it's that outer casing of the nut itself. It's that outer covering, the shuck. Monitor for the shuck split. About this time of year, maybe a little bit earlier than now, that shuck will start to split. Just wait for it to split till it looks a little bit dry to gather those nuts off of the tree. Pecans on the ground, they could have other critters that are on them. They could have dropped to the ground from a critter that got into them while they were developing. We just saw some of that a few moments ago. So there are different methods for getting them out of the tree. Of course, I've seen pictures, historical documents of these gentlemen that would literally climb, dozens of feet up into the tree with these poles and just beat the heck out of the branches to get those pecans to drop. So if you're going to use something like a flailing pole, that's what we call it, a flailing pole, you can do that. It's going to take a little bit of work, but it might be worth the effort. Always make sure to position a tarp underneath that tree so you're catching those nuts, so you don't have to do any more, more work than you have to. What you're looking at on the lower right-hand side is a device that's attached to a tractor. It's called a shaker. The videos that I do have a video of one shaking a tree. It's pretty wild seeing that happen. It's not hurting the tree, believe me, but it's like a tight claw that wraps around the trunk and just vigorously shakes that tree and drops all those nuts down. So, if you happen to, if you have a commercial orchard, of course, you get to know those colleagues that have one of those, because those things are gold. They're expensive to get, but it's well worth your effort to use those if you're into commercial production. Of course, storage, in shell. Want to find a cool place for them, 70 degrees up to 4 months. That means the refrigerator, you can store them in shell, or 18 months at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. You can get a much longer time period out of them the colder that you get them. Keep in mind that these nuts are high in the good oils that we're trying to, that are healthy for us. This is one of the healthiest, it's one of the healthiest natural products that we can get, folks. They have a high nutritive content. They have fantastic the kinds of oils that we need to survive. You know, they're one of the best snacks that money can buy, certainly. But because they have a high oil content, they will go rancid. So you've got to keep them cool. If you're going to keep them longer, of course, you can freeze them, either in shell or out of shell in the freezer. But I'd suggest to use them, you know, within a year. If you've just harvested pecans, spread them out on a table, get a small flat fan, blow it over those nuts in shell, just to get them to dry out a bit prior to, you know, having them in a bowl for people to crack when they come by your office or your house. Again, you can freeze them, but that also has a shelf life associated with that. Well, folks, I thank you very much for joining me today. Kevin, I know I went a little bit over time, but are there any other questions that anyone has? I know you've been answering them.
There's been several questions that I'd like your opinion on. I've given my opinion, but I'm certainly not an expert on pecans. There was a question about pruning, about when the best time to prune was. I believe it's late winter, but are you trying to hit them just before they leaf out and do the pruning right at that point? Can you give them a little bit of information on pruning?
Well, yes, that it is a good idea to, I would recommend to wait until you see those, well, gosh. Pruning is best done. I agree. Pruning is best performed in late winter, but keeping in mind that, you know, the flowering parts of the tree, you're going to have to try to identify where the flowering parts of the tree are, how much of a canopy you actually have, so that you're not cutting off this year's blooms, right? So it is a good idea to go ahead and do some maintenance pruning in late winter, but always keep in mind to keep some of the branching structures intact for the production for flower production as well. Late winter is a great. One more thing. Late winter is a great time also, before the flowers begin to express, or before that new growth occurs, to gather graft wood. Right. So if you're thinking about grafting.
My understanding, Stephen, is that if you train the young pecan trees early on, that there's minimal pruning that needs to be done as they grow older. Is that correct?
That is correct. One of the slides.
And that they produce much better if you only do minimal pruning, that they're not one of the trees that like you go in and you do massive pruning every year.
That's very correct, Kevin. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. We have another question from Melissa Zamora. She says, seeing that pecans seem to be able to grow pecans easily along the Gulf Coast, she's quoting Nueces County particularly. She says, why are there not pecan groves in our regions along the Gulf Coast? Or she says, or even pistachios for that matter.
Well, pistachios I can't talk about. Pecans, because of a high disease pressure, can be discouraging for commercial production. And, you know, here's so an example of that. And again, I can only reference Brazoria County. And Kevin, you can reference Nueces County. For Brazoria County, there is one producer in the county, Lincoln Family Riverbend Pecans, husband and wife that have been doing this for about 5-7 years now, maybe a little bit longer. It's hard work, you know, running a small outfit or even a larger outfit takes a lot of resources financially as well as your time. So it's not for the faint of heart. So my guess is, you know, that's probably one reason why there's not as many pecan producers, you know, commercial pecan producers, at least within our region. There are some individuals that have inherited pecans and are thinking about starting that, but again, you know, money is the limiting factor. But another point about that as well is disease pressure. So we're susceptible to scab, which can affect production as well. The orchard that I've just referred to in Brazoria County, the Lincolns, they have planted out appropriate varieties, and they've minimized the challenges that they face with that kind of disease pressure. So I think it's twofold: as financial as well as disease pressure. But Kevin, could you talk about that as well?
We have no productions, as far as I know, in Nueces County, but I think it's for the very same reasons that you described, that our high humidity and our potential for disease makes it difficult to make the business profitable. It also is similar to like what happens with grapes. It takes quite a few years before you actually start producing and are able to make much profit off of it. So there's a considerable financial input from the very beginning, and then you have to be able to sustain yourself until you actually start making a profit. But I think it is more the second of what you described, and that is that we have a very high disease potential in our area. Okay, you have the last question is from Kathy Pittman, and she's asking about how to deter birds from getting in your pecan trees and getting at your pecans. And I suggested that you could do tree netting if they were smaller trees, but she's talking about trees that are 30 feet or larger. So,
well, okay. Well, referring back to the growers that I met, the Lincolns, they have a device that makes a very loud booming sound, and they're not quite they're like, well, it works, but the birds are trying to figure out the rhythm of when that sound goes off. It's like a loud cannon sound. Now, I wouldn't recommend that at home because your neighbors will get very angry with you if you do that. But I know I jest a little bit, but we're being serious too. You know, like Kevin mentioned, when there's smaller netting, but you can use sound devices, but only if you have, there's no restrictions for using that.
I know the old timers used to go out with a shotgun and blast it every once in a while, but that's going to get you in trouble nowadays too. Kathy was particularly asking about crows, and I said crows are extremely intelligent and they learn and adapt very quickly. So, but I think the grackles, the crows, all of those birds are not going to be easily discouraged. So, I
agree. You just got to live with it. Plus, you're going to produce quite so much on your pecan tree. You're going to share some with the birds anyway. I mean, it's all right. You're not going to lose them all.
Do you think you could do? It's not companion planting with pecans, but could you put out some foods that the crows and the grackles and other birds would like to try to encourage them to eat from the feeders or something, and maybe less from the pecan tree? Or you think they're just going to take your kindness and your pecans?
I think they're gluttonous. Yeah. I don't think they care.
All right. Great presentation today, Stephen.
Thank you, Kevin. Just one more thing. One of the slides that I just breezed over, when you're planting the pecan tree, like peach trees, put it in the ground properly and cut off a third to a half of the top of that, well above the graft union, right? Well above the graft union. And that's done exactly what Kevin had mentioned just a few moments ago, is to create that foundation of a structure so that you won't be trying to manipulate the tree to look the way you think it should look, right? It'll just be maintenance pruning as the tree matures for limb drops or, for hazardous limbs, whatever. Yeah.
I have a personal question myself, Stephen. Back to one of your earlier slides, where you were showing the, was it protagonist?
Yes.
Or basically the trees that are self-pollinating and the trees that you have to have a pollinator in place for. Is that accurate? So what I gathered out of that is that, would it be as simple as if you had a number 1 tree that you were trying to get to produce fruit, then you paired up with a number 2 tree? Is that what I gathered from that chart?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. If you could share that chart with us, that would be great.
Oh, certainly.
Maybe follow email, because that's what I was looking at when you were going over that, and I thought, well, then you would just pick a number 1 that is suitable for your area and a number 2 that's suitable for your area, and you should be good to go.
Yeah. You mean with colleagues? That chart with colleagues?
Or even if you just include it in your follow-up email that has the survey and the recording.
I sure will, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
I'll make a note. Thank you very much. Well, folks, thank you very much. I enjoyed this morning, and it's great to be indoors, especially during a rainy day. But we'll be back again on November the 10th. Kevin, I'm really looking forward to this program.
Me too. Now all I have to do is actually put it together. So. Go, Stephen. All right. Thank y'all for joining us today, and thank you to Stephen for a terrific program as usual. Y'all have a very wonderful day and enjoy the rain. Enjoy your day, Stephen.
All right, you too. Thanks again, Kevin.
Bye-bye.